Okay, great. I think we can get going. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the Forum webinar series. I'm Seri Worden, a Senior Field Director with the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Project Director of the Tidal Basin Ideas Lab. And I'll be hosting today's webinar. Tonight's event is sponsored by Preservation Leadership Forum, which is the professional membership program of the National Trust. This webinar series is made possible by Forum members, and we thank those of you who have joined us today. Today's event is developed in partnership with our friends at Trust for the National Mall and is the third in a series of conversations about the Tidal Basin Ideas Lab and the changing nature of public space and the complexities of its preservation. This session will focus on memorials and controversy in the context of the Tidal Basin. Before we begin, I have just a few technical announcements. We will take questions from the audience during the webinar. Please send those questions directly to the panelists via the Q&A function. And you're welcome to submit those questions at any point during the webinar, but we will hold off on answering audience questions towards the end. And you can also communicate with other participants through the chat function. Following the program, we will send out a recording of today's webinar directly to the email you used to register. And finally, all Forum webinars are archived in our Forum webinar library. And I'll also note we have the closed captioning function for this webinar. So if you need that, please use it. And we welcome all of you. Now I would like to introduce our speakers. Donald Albrecht is an independent curator and author. His exhibitions and books have ranged from overviews of cultural trends to profiles of prominent visual and performing artists. He has worked for the Library of Congress, the Vitra Design Museum, Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, and the Museum of the City of New York, among other institutions. Thomas Mellins has curated exhibitions on a wide variety of architectural and cultural subjects, from 400 years of residential architecture and domestic life in America to the history of the New York Public Library. Additionally, he is the co-author of 3 volumes in an award-winning series of books on the architecture and urbanism of New York City. Donald Albrecht and Tom Mellins are co-curators of the Ideas Lab exhibition, and they will give a brief presentation and then moderate a panel of guest speakers. And I'll introduce those guest speakers now before I turn it over to Donald and Tom. Justin Garrett Moore is joining us. He is a transdisciplinary designer and urbanist and is the program officer for the Humanities in Place program at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. At the foundation, his work focuses on advancing equity, inclusion, and social justice through place-based initiatives, built environments, cultural heritage projects, digital and ephemeral programs, and commemorative spaces and landscapes. We also have Marcel Acosta joining us. He is the executive director of the National Planning Capital Commission, the federal government's central planning agency. He oversees a team of urban planners, architects, historic preservationists, and other professionals who are committed to preserving and enhancing the extraordinary qualities of the National Capital Region. Also, Teresa Durkin, executive vice president of the Trust for the National Mall, will be joining us. The Trust for the National Mall is the leading nonprofit, nonpartisan philanthropic partner of the National Park Service, dedicated to restoring, enriching, and preserving the National Mall, and my partner in crime on the Tidal Basin Ideas Lab. I'd now like to turn it over to Donald and Tom. Thank you.
As Seri mentioned, this evening's webinar, which is part of a series of 4 webinars, that tonight we'll be focusing on the Tidal Basin's memorials. All of them were inspired by the online exhibition that Donald and I curated on the Tidal Basin's Ideas Lab. And in addition to focusing on the proposals that were generated by that, the exhibition looks at the tidal basin's history, as well as the challenges that it faces today. And among those are how to interpret and present the memorials and monuments, and how to engage in the controversies that have been developing around them in a constructive way. For many people, the monuments, including the Jefferson Memorial and more recent memorials to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Martin Luther King, among others, are synonymous with our national identity. And yet they are very much in flux in terms of what they mean and the issues that they raise. And in addition to the controversies, their very existence is threatened by a variety of forces that we'll look at now. So if we can look at the next slide, please. The tidal basin was created in the late 19th century, as you see, the 1880s, and it is the result of a truly remarkable infrastructure project. It's really, in a way, it's a celebration of engineering bravura, in the sense that the Potomac was flooding the area on a daily basis, and subaqueous gates were constructed to control the water's flow. In that process of holding back the water, of regulating the water, a pond was created, and we call that pond, today we call it the tidal basin. If we look at the next slide. Now, from the beginning, from the tidal basin's inception, it has been a magnet for Washingtonians as well as for tourists who come to enjoy the iconic grove of flowering cherry trees, and particularly the annual spring festival that's dedicated to that wonderful event of nature, as well as to participate in recreational activities, including at different times in the tidal basin's history, swimming and fishing, and a variety of activities more and less active. What many people don't realize is that the monumental component of the tidal basin, and we see here the iconic Jefferson Memorial, is actually a more recent addition, and that the Jefferson Memorial, designed by the great American classical architect, classicist architect John Russell Pope, was not completed until 1943, and the other monuments followed. So it's actually a more recent part of our national story. There has been controversy or discussion about these monuments for quite a while, but in recent years, it really has come to the forefront. And perhaps most memorably, last year, there was a op-ed piece in the New York Times written by an heir of Thomas Jefferson. And this man argued that perhaps Jefferson's likeness should actually be replaced by a statue commemorating the abolitionist and former slave Harriet Tubman. Next slide, please. More recently, there was a monument to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, designed by the landscape architect Lawrence Halperin, and completed in 1997. It came to fruition after decades of planning, but even with a long process behind it, it also was the object of discussion and some degree of conflict, which is to say that Halperin had designed a series of outdoor rooms which comprised sculptures. We see here on the right the likeness of Roosevelt with his famous dog Fala, and a series of quotations carved into the granite walls of these roofless enclosures, but there was some concern on the part of activist groups representing disabled Americans that the fact that Roosevelt had been in a wheelchair, the victim of polio, was not acknowledged. And so the sculpture that we see on the left was added. And what Donald and I think this speaks of is simply that these monuments are not either literally or figuratively set in stone in the sense that, that they become part of a national conversation. Okay, if we could go to the next slide, please. More recently, a monument to Martin Luther King Jr. was dedicated in 2011. It was by the sculptor Lee E. Shin, and it is the first monument on the National Mall or in the Tidal Basin area dedicated to an African American. And many people felt that the monument to the great civil rights leader was long in coming, but again, even after a long process, it was not free from controversy. The monument, in addition to the likeness that you see on the right, contains a number of inscriptions of quotations from some of King's most memorable speeches. And one of them was originally read, "I was a drum major for justice, peace, and righteousness," which was paraphrased from one of King's speeches. And some critics argued that it made King seem arrogant. And so it actually has been removed. It was removed 2 years after the memorial was dedicated. Okay, if we could go to the next slide. Now, today, the gates of the original 19th century infrastructure are no longer operable. And so the site once again floods daily. And this is exacerbated by a number of causes that are leading to the waters rising. Among them are actually the entire city of Washington, D.C. is sinking to some degree as a result of tectonic plate shifting, and there's a incidence of subsidence that is causing the waters to rise. If we go to the next slide. In addition to those two factors, the fact that the gates no longer work and that there is subsidence, in a sense, the tidal basin has become a victim of its own success. There are so many people that visit on a daily basis, and particularly the highly popular Cherry Tree Festival each spring brings more than 1 million people to the site. And it's simply, there is wear and tear on the site and on the Earth's ability, it becomes impacted, its ability to absorb water. This becomes exacerbated by overdevelopment or a high degree of development in the area as well. If we go to the next slide.
Thank you. So, thank you, Tom. So,
thank you.
In response to these conditions and these challenges and these problems, the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Trust of the National Mall initiated what they called an Ideas Lab, which was to spark creative ideas for the future of the tidal basin. And there were at least 2 essential principles undergirding the Ideas Lab. One was that 5 landscape architects were invited to participate, and they are these 5 firms: Reed Hildebrand, GNN, D-Land Studio, Walter Hood, and James Corner of Field Operations. The most important part that links them all is that they are landscape architects. And the organizers went to landscape architects because landscape architects think big, they think regionally, and they think over long periods of time. And it was decided that these ways of thinking were important to the future of the tidal basin. The other conscious decision that was made on the part of the organizers was not to hold a competition. A competition has a winner, and oftentimes the participants in a competition are looking over their shoulders trying to second guess what might win, and therefore might be less prompted to be speculative. An Ideas Lab, which does not have a winner, prompts a wider range of responses from the practical to the highly speculative and the theatrical in many ways, as you'll see by what we're going to show you. The landscape architects' all proposals address the site's memorials, and they do so both environmentally, physically, and they do so culturally or socially. Tom and I have selected 3 examples to give you a flavor of the highlights. So 3 of the 5, we're going to show you how they address the memorials. The proposal on the screen now by D-Land Studio, which is headed by Susanna Drake, called for 2 major infrastructural moves that relate to the monuments. You can see on the lower left-hand corner of your screen, they propose building a new jetty off of the Lincoln Memorial into the Potomac. And on the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you see a kind of land bridge that has been built connecting the Jefferson Memorial to the Washington Monument. Could I have the next image? The next image. This is the view of the land bridge that is connecting the Jefferson Memorial to the Washington Monument, and it has 2 effects. One is it creates a kind of ceremonial front yard, a landscape front yard to the memorial, to the Jefferson Memorial, and the cherry trees for environmental reasons have been relocated here. It also provides easier access from the tidal basin to the National Mall. One of the problems has been circulation, has been difficult with security issues and flooding. This land bridge would actually cause an easier access to the National Mall, which is the main event in Washington, D.C. Could I have the next image? And this is the view of the jetty, which D-Land Studio, Susanna Drake, proposes moving the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial to this jetty, which has 2 effects. One is to move the memorial to a safer place, free from rising seas and climate changes, but also culturally, it makes a direct link in the visitor's mind to King and to Lincoln, 2 historic figures in African-American history in the United States. Could I have the next image? Another was the work of Walter Hood Design Studio in Oakland, California. In his scheme, he takes what we would call a narrative approach to the site, and he imagines what he calls a novella in 4 parts. And part of the novella's themes or purposes is to uncover and to memorialize hidden histories. So he's not building anything new, no new memorial. He's adding signage to interpret the memorial and to interpret the site and to memorialize it in that way. Interpretive signage would point out, for instance, that wetlands in nearby plantations served as what were called hush harbors. These were places where enslaved people congregated and practiced religion in secret, and it's a major factor in the creation of the Black church in the United States. So he wouldn't be building a hush harbor, but he would be interpreting the hush harbors to memorialize and commemorate that fact of American history. Could I have the next? On a physical level, a couple of the schemes propose to let the site flood, to let waters rise. In Walter Hood's case, it creates a kind of necklace of monuments that are linked by new construction bridges. Could I have the next slide? Field operation, James called a field operation, is another scheme that fashions the site into what he calls an island archipelago of monuments which are accessed by boat. So it takes advantage, if you will, of climate change by letting the site flood and creating islands that can be landscaped that hold the monuments. And the final image, this is also field operations. This is probably the most provocative and speculative image. The question he's raising is, Should we let the site flood? And should we let nature take over? The site floods and monuments gracefully age, and in this scheme, decay into picturesque ruins. Could I have the next image? So you could see the range is quite broad, from the speculative to the more practical. This final image of the online exhibition, the Tidal Basin Ideas Lab, is a page that prompts participation. A major goal of the online exhibition is advocacy. And we're urging people to participate not only in programs like this, but to go to the site, to use the site, to register for surveys, to post Instagram posts of your experience at the tidal basin, to generate as much image and as much interest in the tidal basin as is possible, to generate public interest so funding can be created to save this priceless heritage. Okay, now we're going to be joined by our panelists.
So Donald and I welcome you, Justin, Marcel, and Teresa. And we wanted to start by giving you the opportunity to tell us a little bit about yourselves, and particularly how your professional experience illuminates the ways in which you approach the tidal basin, and particularly the idea of the monuments and concomitant controversies, and the what questions that raises in terms of their preservation. So we wanted to start with Justin, with you, and if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. First, apologies to Vance if there are any connectivity issues. I'm joining from Kigali, Rwanda, so pretty far away. But I have 2 points of entry, actually, to this conversation. I was introduced as being a program officer for the Mellon Foundation, where I'm involved in the foundation's Monuments Project. But prior to that role, I was also the executive director of the Public Design Commission in New York City, the city's design review agency that includes public art and public monuments. And following Charlottesville, we had a number of really challenging conversations and engagements with people in multiple sectors and from multiple points of view about the role and the importance of monuments, not only in the city, but really in our kind of national landscape and understanding. And so the first kind of point I'll sort of make or mark is that there's very often a point or a comment that people will make that monuments are sort of a background, or that they're sort of affecting kind of a limited slice of people in society. And I really would challenge and press on that, because we saw it in real time and in a sustained and kind of collective way that these spaces and the elements of our built environment do matter. They matter a lot, actually. And we saw that in the multiple conversations, people coming out for public hearings, about how we would sort of collectively value and sort of maintain and kind of empower our shared public realm and public landscapes that are activated and charged by monuments and through the power of built environment, the power of representation, the power of art, the power of the word in our spaces. The other kind of point I would sort of note is that in these conversations, I think the key question that comes up is a question of power, right? Who has the ability to shape things in spaces that we are meant to have in common? And that's obviously incredibly evident in places like the National Mall. But it's something that we need to engage in to understand who is reflected in our spaces, who has been able to show their presence, to tell their story, to kind of have their kind of identity become a part of our collective and shared identity and history. Kind of switching hats a little bit to more my current role at the Mellon Foundation, I think there's an expansion of this question in this project to really think about what types of work are monuments doing, right, for us and for society, and whether that's addressing issues of repair, addressing issues of justice, but also thinking about what kinds of roles do we want our spaces to have in our society, and vice versa, right? Our spaces are shaping society, and our society are shaping our spaces. And how do we do that in a way that best reflects our values, our individual values, our collective values, in ways that we can all sort of kind of imagine the world that we want together.
Great, thank you so much. Very informative. Marcel, do you want to?
Certainly. Thank you again, Thomas. And this is a great opportunity to explore the opportunities at the Tidal Basin, but also talk a bit about the importance of these memorials and monuments, not only to the city, but also to the nation at large. My agency, which is the National Capital Planning Commission, is responsible for the review and approval of memorials and monuments in the nation's capital. So we have dealt a lot with the approvals of such memorials, such as the FDR Memorial, which you showed in your presentation, the Martin Luther King Memorial. And we kind of take it through iterative steps. Obviously, Congress makes the final determination about the authorization of the memorial. And to some extent, they grant us the opportunity to identify locations where these memorials should be placed. And also both the Commission of Fine Arts and the National Capital Planning Commission work together to review and approve the final design of those memorials. And those are typically shepherded through sponsor groups and also through the National Park Service or the General Services Administration, which essentially are the property owners. And essentially those are turned back to the federal government through the National Park Service for the day-to-day operations of the memorial. So we deal with that in terms of a traditional design review process. Also, we're responsible for the long-range planning from the federal government side of the nation's capital. Much of our responsibility and focus has been on the future of commemoration. We tended to focus much of this on the land assets in terms of where they should go. And if you think about it, there's a lot of competition for sites in and around the National Mall. And so to a great extent, we're not only looking for today, but into the future, and for instance, for future generations, in terms of what sites could be made available, and to ensure that there are locations where future events, future people, and future things that are of consequence to this nation are have an opportunity to be represented in the nation's capital. I think one of the most important things that we've been dealing with, and I think all of us have been grappling with, is this is a symbolic space. This is a very sacred space. This is a place where everyone feels a need to be represented. They want their stories told. And I think the proximity to the levers of government, the Capitol, the White House, the Supreme Court, and kind of that notion of, you know, if my people are here, if my experience has been represented here, if something that is important to me or people that I care about are on the mall or around the mall, then I've been acknowledged, I've been recognized. So I think that's basically a large undercurrent of site decisions that we face on an ongoing basis. I also think in the long term, we've been exploring, I think as Justin has mentioned, what has been unrepresented. That to a great extent, all the memorials and monuments that you see in Washington, D.C. tell the story of America. It's, and a great extent has been a bottoms-up process that sponsors will go to Congress, they'll get their memorials approved. There's a big haul in terms of fundraising and constructing it. So that's important. And I think that is essentially what gives us the memorials that we see today, at least in the recent past. But I do think there are, if you kind of look at the inventory of memorials in Washington, D.C., many of them, a majority, around 50%, deal with military and military conflict. And that's very important to our history. But what about sciences? What about arts? What about the work of women, about brown and black people in our country? What has that role been? And what have they played? And kind of are those stories, should those stories be told, and in what fashion? So I think we're starting to explore many of those questions in kind of our next generation of memorial research. And I think this is really an exciting time to bring those issues in terms of having a larger conversation about what that means, and kind of different ways to manifest that in our cultural landscape, which I think is going to be an amazing experience over the course of many generations. So I think that's a bigger issue that I hope this panel will discuss, but I do think that the issue of representation is important.
Thank you. Teresa.
Thanks, Donald. In my role as a project director for the Trust for the National Mall, it's to fulfill our mission, which is to help the National Park Service enhance, restore, and preserve the National Mall. But we do recognize, and looking at the history is a big part of understanding the National Mall and the memorials that are in it. The name of the place is actually National Mall and Memorial Parks. So what we recognize is that as we look at this place, it's very, very clear that it has evolved a lot over time. It wasn't built all at once, and it wasn't conceived full blown by one plan. It was built over a couple of centuries. And so I'm a landscape architect, and I tend to look at it that way through the lens of a landscape architect and a planner on how the place has evolved. And even our relationships to the monuments and memorials has evolved. What's happened is, over 2 centuries, how we think about this place in the landscape has changed. And we used to talk about, in the 19th century, the public grounds, which is, a landscape with gardens and paths and things. But that really evolved to the concept, a more modern concept of public space or the public realm. And that's what really changed the place and made it more powerful, because the landscape and the monuments became an ensemble that uplifted the notion of creating space for public gatherings, exercising First Amendment rights, and so on and so on. And I love this, a quote from Kirk Savage, who from his wonderful book, Monument Wars, because as we all know, every monument had a war around it before it was built. The power of the symbolic landscape rests on the command of the space. And what we're seeing right now is that the National Mall and the Tidal Basin in particular is a particularly fragile and vulnerable landscape. And we're troubled about the command of the space in the future. And so that's what really gave birth to the Ideas Lab. So we could think about all these complex issues, one of which is, can we create and establish a model for collaboration and interpretation of monuments and memorials that is more inclusive than we see these days?
I actually am going to jump in. There was a very interesting question that popped up, and it was for Justin, and I would love to just ask you. The question, I hope I'm saying it right, what did you mean by the word repair? And how do we know when a monument has been repaired? Was a question that I think is really interesting, building on what you were saying.
Sure, and I actually would connect it to actually the sort of the time frame that Teresa was just talking about, sort of the scales of hundreds of years. And so when I talk about repair, we have to, I think, have broader conversations about all of our various types of structures and constructs that become present in our built environment, in our landscapes, and our public realm. And so there are constructs like things like monuments, or constructs like a tidal basin controlling flooding and water, But there are also constructs like systemic racism, kind of structural inequality through various forms of capital and labor. There are a lot of different kind of structures that we have to talk about. So you can talk about repair in terms of kind of things that may be present or built, but there are multiple layers and multiple facets to this conversation of repair. So that work, the types of work that you may do, may be addressing something like the engineering or the kind of redesign reconsideration for the relationship between humans and environment and water and climate, that you can go back and redesign and re-engineer and kind of repair our relationship to how we take space. But you can also have repair in terms of some of the points that Marcel was kind of underlining about who is represented, who is empowered, who has been given agency to create and shape space and kind of collective moment. So, you know, it's sort of a term that talks about what has happened or what has been allowed to not happen in a way. You know, for the capital projects type people, right? Deferred maintenance. We have many different types of deferred maintenance for the different types of work that we need to do as a society. You know, not just for like, you know, keeping our roads or our water tunnels in good shape, but in terms of keeping our commons, our kind of shared experiences and landscapes in good shape in ways that will take multiple types of efforts of repair. So it's meant to be kind of a broad term that captures many different things.
You mentioned the subject of agency has come up. How do we broaden how do we make this creation of memorials in the United States where more people are becoming agents? The stewards that exist, the funders, the general public, how do we increase that agency?
Yeah, would anyone like to jump in, or Marcel, do you want to respond to that? And then Teresa, tell us.
Me unmute here. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question about you know, who is commemorated or what is commemorated and kind of the role of the public in that discourse. Right now, I would characterize the process as a project by project effort that, you know, a constituency group that wants to be recognized goes to Congress, finds a champion. They have to have a real commitment to getting it done. And then they basically, a lot of times a commission is formed and, you know, but it's kind of kept within that basic framework that there, and since Congress doesn't authorize the memorial, at least for national ones, that, you know, it is public in that sense, but there isn't like a huge, large public discourse about storytelling, different perspectives, what stories being told. And kind of how that is manifested in kind of the physical side of the memorial itself. And it does go through our commissions, and the public has an opportunity to provide that input in the discussion, but it's basically incremental at that point. You're basically working off a basic framework that the designer and the sponsors have kind of created. So I think that I'm just saying that in terms of how the process works today. And that it is bottoms up in the sense that it does arise from members of the public who have an interest in seeing this in the nation's capital. But the process is somewhat limited just because of the way it's set up in terms of encouraging larger discourse. I think there's a bigger question about if you wanted to talk about who is, you know, the broader issue of what is missing and kind of the relative values of what should be there or what should not. I think that is a totally different construct of a conversation that you would have to have with the public. And I do think the work that the Mellon Foundation is doing today, a lot of the groups out there, I think are kind of leading to that point where, you know, we have to have a broader discussion. We need to have facts on the table in terms of what's there or what's not. We need to understand that even with memorials today, there are conflicting viewpoints and conflicting perspectives of what that story that's currently being told is out there, and how is that going to be changed, or should it be changed over time. So I think that's a somewhat slower process, but I think it is an important one, in that I don't necessarily think it's up to just government to lead that conversation. I think they have a very important role to play, but I do think the not-for-profit sector, many people out in the community organizations, I think have an important role. But I think to some extent, somebody has to organize it.
Is the Mellon initiative, was it started to broaden the number of people in the conversation?
Yeah, the Mellon work is about humanity and complexity, essentially, like in the broadest sense. And you know, a point that I think Marcel was just raising, I think, kind of gets to this point of what do we mean by we, right? And that has to broaden, and that we have to understand that you know, there is complexity in that conversation. And so instead of the idea of not replacing one kind of singular or narrow history for another presumably correct or more appropriate or more representative one, it's actually to do the work of broadening who is involved, who can be a part of that complex we, right? The kind of the multitude in a way. And this idea of what does public participation, interaction, agency look like, does have to kind of factor in conflict, complexity, learning and unlearning in a way. And I think a lot of public processes and what this work might look like has to frankly develop some new tools and new approaches for doing work, right? The process that Marcel is sort of identifying is based on kind of a certain type of power structure, financial structure that has left a lot of people out. And we have a lot of evidence that shows that it leaves a lot of people out. Frankly, the entire design community, how we do any kind of place-changing work, has similar structural issues in terms of how decisions are made. And so the design community itself, thinking about how does it involve people when it's developing work and changing ideas for place, may need some new and different tools. And so the Mellon effort is actually looking to kind of promote more innovation, more exploration, and more complexity in doing that work.
Can I just add one thing? I think the issue here, I think there is a difference in terms of, we tend to view monuments and memorials in terms of design. But I think the big missing piece right now, this is a question about public history. And that to the extent that those experts, but also interested members of the public, kind of bringing stories, perspectives, and kind of sifting through all that and kind of making it manifest itself in some sort of either a memorial or an event or whatnot, I think is kind of the interesting question here, is that, you know, we're planners, we're designers, we're landscape architects, and we all have a hand in this. But I think at least my view is, personal view, is that, you know, the big missing gap is kind of like the public history. And where do you place this into kind of the spectrum of issues? And also, how do you view this with the experience of time? We get a little bit of that in our discussions, but I think there has to be a lot more, because in terms of how that memorial is designed is actually a kind of outcome of that story. And whoever controls that story kind of sees itself in the memorial.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's kind of the bigger issue that I hope we're able to address at some point.
I wanted to pick up on that notion.
Can I follow up on that, Thomas?
Yes.
Absolutely.
I really, you know, just want to reinforce what Marcel and Justin are saying. And some of the things that have risen up out of the Ideas Lab is that we need to be open to a new set of principles for memorial landscapes over time. And I think what we have gotten out of this initiative from the 5 landscape architects is a vision, it envisions a landscape of what it might actually look like in the future in terms of memorials, a living landscape, a more diverse landscape, and one that's open to change. And so, you know, these things can be very abstract when we're talking about them, but what the Ideas Lab has given us is a set of visions that will help to further this dialogue, particularly around memorials. It's not just about infrastructure and ecological systems. It's more about guidelines and policies that can help us to implement change. So
And
get the
Teresa
plug in
knows,
for the Ideas Lab.
Teresa knows very well also the destruction of the cherry trees, which is a kind of ephemeral memorial. You know, we always think of memorials as being brick and mortar and stone and marble, but one of the memorials at the Tidal Basin is a memorial to time and to nature. And what makes the cherry trees so prominent and so powerful is they come and go. The blossoming is so quick, and they are being destroyed, as well as the brick and mortar monuments.
Right, which I think pushes the conversation into a slightly different direction. And I'd like to open it up, which is, what about the element of time, and particularly how it relates to the telling of public history? And are there opportunities to program this space, or even to really blur the distinction between the different kind of monuments that Donald was just talking about, the brick and mortar and one based in time? Can we in fact liberate ourselves from thinking about those as two separate silos? And are there opportunities to make the meaning or the access to meaning more porous and more accessible through events and through different kinds of memorials that don't necessarily last for all time? So to you all.
I'll start. So actually, I think there's a slide of the voiceover with the Jefferson Memorial and the parents. So if you could put that up. In 2006, we held a design competition along with the National Park Service and the Van Allen Institute out in New York to look. It was called Memorials for the Future, and it kind of looked at opportunities to express memorials beyond granite in terms of what we see today, and also to kind of think about, are there different ways of commemoration, not only in kind of the traditional physical forms that we see today. I think one of the big questions here, and one of the big topics that a lot of the participants had wanted to put forward, is this notion of having a conversation about subject matter. In this case, we're seeing two versions of it at the Thomas Jefferson Memorial. That, you know, the memorial itself tells a certain story. You could read a lot into it in terms of your own views, but a lot of times there are multiple views, as somebody pointed out earlier, about Thomas Jefferson and his history and his meaning to the country, for good and for bad. Traditionally, I think people 15 years ago would have thought holding a little computer in your hand, a cell phone, was almost possible to think of. But voila, today we have that. And that's one way of getting different perspectives and narratives out there and giving people a bit more context in terms of what Thomas Jefferson was about. I think people are probably wondering on the right side, what's up with the pink parrots? This was an entry called Voiceover. And essentially this was an effort to record stories from everyday people, retold by everyday people, about aspects of the subject matter, to kind of get different points of view and different points and perspectives across the table. Essentially, these parents would come in, pre-record these stories, a flock of them would come to the memorial, and that would provide an opportunity to tell these stories at certain periods of time, and also to get engaged in public in some sort of discourse about the meaning of that memorial. That was a more fanciful and playful way to express what you could do with technology that we have today. But I think it just brings up the point that there are multiple stories out there, there are multiple perspectives that need to be told, and that people can make up their own minds about what they, how they want to perceive, but they also should have the benefit of hearing other people's stories and views. So I think this is what this allows us to do
Mm.
beyond a architectural piece or a built permanent piece. And we're also thinking a bit more about temporary commemoration on the mall. If you thought about the inauguration, President Biden's inauguration, there was a very moving ceremony the day before the inauguration at the reflecting pool, which commemorated the people lost to COVID-19. That in fact was a temporary memorial. It was an event, but it took advantage of the place, the symbolism of the National Mall as a place of healing. And I think much more can be done in that that avenue and with that opportunity to kind of use that setting as a way to reconcile, to have conversations, and in a way that's not necessarily done in a permanent built monument or memorial. So I think that's where we see kind of the future. And I also think even with that example, as well as the AIDS quilt, I think are great examples.
Yes, the AIDS quilt is a great example.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree that the conversation about the ephemeral and the programmatic are really important, especially when we talk about this idea of kind of public participation and kind of connection for place and history and story. You know, kind of an alternate example we saw recently in DC would have been the Black Lives Matter mural, right? The kind of the marking, literal marking of people and their power in a place that matters and has power, having an effect that ultimately, as we all know, was connected to kind of a moment and a movement that people were going through, but also connected to other places. So we had other cities and other communities that you may not have even associated or thought about being connected to these ideas, being able to kind of mark their spaces. I'll have another inauguration example. I just put a link in the chat because there's no way I can share a video from Kigali. But during the inauguration, Step Africa, African-American dance troupe, did a performance at the Jefferson Memorial on the Tidal Basin. And so the idea of, you know, talking about, again, that notion of complexity. So yes, Jefferson, one of our presidents, important leader in history, but telling of a different kind of story by having an African-American dance troupe perform and sort of take and have some measure of control and reflection in that space at, frankly, an important time, kind of socially and politically, was very powerful, and not always expressing things in a way that you might think, right? To talk about Jefferson and slavery, for example, but instead to talk about the presence and power and importance of Black people in this country, right? As another mode of expression and claiming and making of space. So I think this idea of kind of pushing the boundaries a bit on what we mean by commemoration, memory, story, presence, power, to do so in broader ways is really important.
Teresa, your thoughts that you want to share?
Well, I started out by talking about the history and that this is really a place that has evolved over time.
Yeah.
And I really do believe that we're in one of those important moments right now in the history of the National Mall, where we're going to take advantage of just the inevitability of change. And with that change is going to come many, many new innovations, such as we're seeing here and that Justin and Marcel are talking about, and that the Trust is planning also around public education and awareness. The time has come to do these things because we continue to evolve. And over time, we may find that some of our monuments are not relevant anymore unless we continue to layer in these stories. So I'm very hopeful.
Marcel, what is this on the screen now?
What you see on the screen right now was actually the winner of our design competition in 2016. This is called Climate Chronograph. And this is very similar to some of the ideas that came out of the Ideas Lab, but this literally was a memorial to climate change and kind of the impacts of rising sea levels on public space. And if this example is a grove of cherry trees had been planted at the end of Haynes Point, which is a low point by the Potomac River. And over time, over generations, it will flood. That shoreline will be missing over the course of years. And essentially, they would plant the trees and people would mark that time. And over the course of successive generations, you'll see the trees disappearing. And it was a way to kind of measure that impact in a meaningful way. I think what's interesting about this is a memorial about the future, as opposed to a memorial about the past. I think that's what made this, and it was very deliberate in terms of using this as a way to have a conversation about what climate change means and what it is doing on a slow, but kind of on a daily basis. And your children and your grandchildren will be able to see the dead trees that were once thriving, and they would kind of remember what that impact had been. So this was a winner of our competition.
So should we open it up to there it is, questions and answers? Yes. All right. So now
All right. Good timing. Well, thank you, panelists. It's a really fascinating conversation and a lot to unpack here. And like our other webinars, this really helps inform the Tidal Basin Ideas Lab and the future of our work at the Tidal Basin. So we don't have a ton of time, and I'm sorry for that, for questions from the public. We'll do our best to follow up with you. But I do have one question here I'd like to try to have the panelists address, and it is this. Many people may not realize how commemoration affects them and their communities. What strategies would the panel recommend to engage with people with all levels of awareness of the topic to reflect a more complete cross-section of community input when considering changes to the tidal basin?
Okay.
Anybody?
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
I'll jump in. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
So I'll jump in, and this is, maybe with a bit of bias, but I do think that the role of artists, and I mean that in a broad way, at the intersection of what Marcel raised earlier, the role of kind of historians and scholars, is a really interesting and important point, because the work of research, people finding histories, doing the kind of the not so sexy and not so visible work of kind of uncovering and collecting and elevating these stories. It's difficult to get that work to a broader public, but that is a place where artists of different kinds, different medias, different modes of expression can have a great way of doing that work. Whether it's a visual artist doing a temporary sculpture, or a choreographer and dance company activating a space, or a poet sort of giving voice to maybe a history or a narrative, and doing that in public, doing that in space through different modes, I think is really powerful way to engage. Again, this idea of how do we broaden the conversation. Arts and culture are great ways to kind of find different ways to connect to different audiences and different people. And especially when we talk about, again, the kind of the multitude of different modes of expression, different modes of participation through the work of artists.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm afraid our time is up. I think we could talk for a great deal longer about these incredible topics. But if we haven't answered your question, please reach out to us. I'll show you an email at the end, and we'll do our best to get back to you. But you can also keep talking. Forum Connect is available to all, and it's online and free and open to anyone. So if there's a particular topic that you found interesting today, or a line of conversation, feel free to get on Forum Connect and keep that conversation going.
I say we do a panel about our arts and culture next.
Yeah, I like it. Absolutely. And we do have a couple of webinars coming up that I invite you all to attend. We have an event regarding the Brown v. Board decision. It's Students on Strike to Massive Resistance in Farmville, Virginia, and that'll be on April 12th. And then we will have our fourth and final for the series Tidal Basin webinar regarding funding the public sphere, and that will be April 21st, 5:30 Eastern, like today's event. So I thank you all. I thank our panelists. And we just had a wonderful conversation. It's really fantastic. I'm so grateful for this intriguing conversation. It's a lot to think about. And I thank all of our participants as well. We couldn't do this without you, so we appreciate that. And if you have any questions, certainly reach out to us at forum@savingplaces.org, and we will get back to you. So thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
And hope to see everyone soon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you all. Good night.